the feeling is if Israel wants to be an occupying country, then it needs to step up and do all the things that an occupying country has to do, which is take care of the population that it is occupying.
As Israel calls for residents of northern Gaza to leave, concerns are growing around the movement of refugees. Where will they go? Neighbouring Egypt has said that it will not accept a solution that forces Palestinians to cross the border into Egypt without hope of a return back to Gaza. So let's talk to Mirette Mabrouk, former Egyptian journalist and founding director of the Egypt programme at the Middle East Institute. Mirette, hello and good evening to you.
Hello.
Can you tell us what Egypt's starting position is with this? Because I'm old enough to remember the day when President Sadat shook the hand of Menachem Begin, the Israeli leader, and we've had 40 years of relatively stable relations between Egypt and Israel. But the Gazans need to get out. It's going to be very difficult for them to stay in that tiny strip of land and emerge unharmed. And they could go across the border. So what's Egypt's starting position on that?
Okay. So you mentioned the good relationship with Israel. Egypt and Israel actually have a very solid, good working relationship. However, what we have at the moment, and generally speaking, Egypt has been the top mediator between the Palestinians and Israel, and very often between Hamas and Israel, because of course Hamas don't represent all Palestinians. They don't even really represent the Palestinians in the West Bank, because there haven't been elections, in Gaza, because there haven't been elections in Gaza for 17 years. But in this particular case, one of the things that Egypt is worried about is what's sometimes referred to as an old trope, but which Palestinians and Egyptians see as a reality, because all you need to do really is look at the camps in Lebanon, who hold almost 500,000 Palestinian refugees who are the descendants of Palestinians who were pushed out of Israel in 48 and 56 and 67, and another more than 2 million like them in Jordan, and they've never been able to go back. Right. And actually, during this, I mean, a lot of Gazans have been saying, we don't want to go, we want to stay, we don't want to go into Egypt, basically because they understand that if they leave, it will be impossible for them to go back.
Yeah.
Now, that is not the same as not providing aid. Egypt says it's ready and willing to provide aid, and has actually, it did actually move humanitarian convoys up and were refused by the Israelis to start off with. And then, of course, the border crossing, and you have to remember there are only two crossings, there are only two ways in and out of Gaza, one controlled by the Israelis and one by the Egyptians. And of course, that was blown up.
Mm-hmm. And I see that the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, said this week, in fact, just yesterday, he said, this is the cause of all causes, the cause of all Arabs. It's important that the Palestinian people remain steadfast and present on their land. But only yesterday I spoke to a leading British Palestinian who said, we don't really have any friends in the region. You know, when we look around and we look for real support, it's not there. And that's one of the sources of the frustration. What would you say to that?
So I actually heard Mr. Tamimi's interview yesterday. It was excellent. In some ways, he's not wrong. He's certainly not wrong in that the Palestinians have consistently, for the past 75 years, drawn the short straw. They are surrounded, they are miserable, and aid from Arab countries, I mean, will keep them afloat, but it's not enough. I mean, if you live in Gaza, I mean, Gaza has been described as the world's largest open-air prison, and ultimately the arbiters of that are the Israelis. Now, the Israelis will say that they left Gaza in 2006. Well, yes, but that's like my selling you a home. Say, yes, you can have this home and I'll move out, but I control the doors, I control the windows. You can't move in and out without my say-so. You can't get a job without my say-so. I control your water, your electricity, your gas, and your internet, and no one can come in and out, but you can have the house. and that's what living in Gaza is like.
Well, the Israelis say the reason we're doing this is because you keep trying to stab us, you keep trying to bomb us, and you won't have proper negotiations with us. And your guy over in the West Bank, Abu Mazen, or Mahmoud Abbas, he doesn't really have much influence and power. He isn't a proper negotiating partner either. So what are we to do?
Again, so Israel has just sort of had one of the worst shocks of its existence. I mean, honestly, what happened was quite horrible. And nobody is going to support loss of life. No, it's certainly not civilian loss of life. So it was terrible. But if Abu Mazen isn't a good interlocutor, sometime over the last 75 years, you would have thought that there was, a Palestinian that the Israelis could talk to, but apparently not, because we've been in this position. We've been in this position since, and I think a lot of people will say, honestly, the situation is not going to change until you come to a just agreement with each other, and that just agreement does not include the treatment that Palestinians have received over the past 75 years, and has only increased under this present government, which is Israel's most right-wing ever.
When earlier this week, the Palestinian Authority called for an emergency meeting of the Arab League, I thought, okay, let's see what happens now, because you've got big, solid players, like Egypt, of course, like Saudi Arabia, all potentially partners. Well, some have been partners for a long time, but also Saudi, potentially a partner with Israel. You've got, Jordan. Syria, different case, of course, hostile to Israel. But you've got lots and lots of countries that are talking differently about relations with Israel now. And I thought they're going to get together and do something, say something, try and create some imaginative solution, as people have been calling for. And yet, nothing.
Well, again, you're not wrong. I think that that's the frustration of a lot of people with the Arab League. But to be fair to
is
the
it that
Arab
they
League,
just simply, because somebody said on social media today, why is it that none of the Arab countries want large groups of Palestinians in their country? They're more likely to get a better welcome in a country like Germany than they are in somewhere like Saudi. Even though there are millions of them, of course, in Jordan, and millions in Lebanon, the huge numbers in Lebanon too. But their condition is still terrible.
Again, yes or no, that's kind of simplistic.
Yeah.
What people don't want is another mass expulsion of Palestinians. But I once spent time in Kuwait, and Kuwait had about, at the time, 400,000 Palestinians that were all living and working and happy there. So it's not that. There is a difference between you going abroad and you working somewhere and you having a life somewhere, and you being forced out and having to either be a refugee or a displaced person. People do not object to people coming to their countries and working, living. What they object to is what they see as shouldering Israel's burden. The feeling is, if Israel wants to be an occupying country, then it needs to step up and do all the things that an occupying country has to do, which is take care of the population that it is occupying. And that's not the case. Now, at the end of the day, the people who are really getting in the neck here are the Palestinians. Yeah. And again, I am not saying that the Israelis have not suffered over the past week. They most certainly have. But the Palestinians have been suffering for a very, very long time, 75 years. And it's what happened. The only thing that's really surprising over what happened was the extent and the ferocity and the savagery, but not that it happened, because if you deny people the most basic hope, if you like, you can't really be surprised if they strike out.
Although on the Israeli side, they say these people are nihilistic. They put their own people in harm's way. They're not trying to get a political solution. They want the eradication of Israel. So how do we talk to them? And stepping back from that, what is the attitude of, for example, Egypt to Hamas? Because they formed out of it has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, And we saw how President al-Sisi dealt with the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, Mohammed Morsi. And having been to Egypt a couple of times, it's very clear he does not want any resurgence of what he might see as Islamism in the Arab Republic of Egypt.
Okay, you are right on all of that. There is no love lost. Egypt and actually much of the region, there is no love lost for Islamists. There is certainly no love lost in Egypt for Hamas, but there is an enormous amount of sympathy for the Palestinians. And even though Hamas were last elected 17 years ago and have sort of de facto forced themselves on the Palestinians, these are the people who are allegedly speaking for the Palestinians in Gaza. And what's happening at the moment is, while everyone can understand Israel's anger at Hamas, what people don't understand is, even though they've seen it before over and over, is the collective punishment being imposed on 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. It should be something else, but it isn't. It's all being lumped into one unfortunate barrel, and the people who are paying for it are the people of Gaza.
You know, Israelis and people who support Israel often say it is the only democracy in the region. Is one of the reasons why the support for the Palestinians is so patchy that many of the leaders of those Arab countries are pretty adept at repressing populations in their own country too.
So I'm certainly not going to argue about the state of democracy in the region, okay? And honestly, I would include Israel with that. I mean, I know people like to say it's the only democracy in the region, but I do think that if you're an Arab Israeli, for example, you don't quite feel the same way. But having said that, I think this is where one of the dangers lies at the moment, which one of the reasons why it's all so volatile at the moment. There is very often a gap between what governments want and think and say and feel, and what their constituents want and think and say and feel. In this case, there is very much a gap. As we've established, Egypt has a good relationship with, the government of Egypt has a good relationship with the government of Israel, successive governments in Israel, and even governments that are not elected. The UAE, normalized with Israel.
Bahrain, Morocco.
Bahrain, there have been talks with Saudi Arabia, but they have publics, and those publics feel differently. And the more anger there is over this issue, the more difficult governments will find it to keep their publics in check. And at some point, they're going to say, right, well, do we want to move forward with more normalizing with Israel, or do we want to keep control on our domestic populations? I don't think it is. I don't think they're going to toss the ball over in Israel's direction just because.
Because the USA is encouraging it, you mean?
Not really, but domestic stability is more important than potential foreign relations.
Mirette, how do you see this tragic situation, this terrible situation playing out? Do you see it with Gaza being further depopulated, with people having to cross the border into Egypt, and with the near entire strip being razed to the ground?
So I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that a lot, I think you're probably not far off. Certainly the Egyptians, while they have said we don't want this to happen, while they said they don't want the border breached, they realize it might very well happen, and they've prepared for it. I think last Sunday, the governor of North Sinai held a crisis meeting. They've allocated buildings for refugees. They've taken inventories. They've flown in tons of humanitarian aid, and they've asked international donors to use the airport in North Sinai, Larish, to fly in humanitarian aid. So they know that it very, very well might happen. Now, the problem for Egypt is undergoing its worst economic crisis in well over half a decade, I think, and it's already had 325,000 to date refugees pour over its southern border from the conflict in Sudan. So it's already sort of stuck. But they are worried that that's going to happen. I think everyone is worried that that's going to happen. I think everyone thinks that Israel is going to use the opportunity and is going to raise Gaza to the ground. Now, the situation is still not going to be solved. And I honestly think that if Israel wants to have any chance of just having any sort of a proper lasting peace, the only way through this is a just settlement.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's really nowhere to go, because the chances that you will be able to eradicate every single Palestinian are not great. Because, I mean, even if, despite what we are currently seeing, it is unlikely that after all the rage dies down, the international community will continue to give Israel a blank check.
Yeah.